And that was a little later too, which I think is a natural thing, you know. Suddenly we've got lives.
Ringo Starr truly hated him more than anyone.
So, you know, it seemed to be you came to see the Beatles and then Paul counted it in, then you just screamed till we bowed and left. But it was great. The atmosphere was great.
Some legends walk into fame like they were born for it. Ringo Starr walked into it carrying a target on his back. From the very first day, he wasn't welcomed as the fourth brother of the Beatles. He was the replacement the world assumed could be swapped out again at any moment. Under the stage lights, he smiled, waved, kept the beat steady, while newspapers mocked him as the luckiest drummer alive, the one who didn't truly earn his place. Behind the scenes, it was worse. Industry insiders whispered that he didn't have the talent. One bandmate treated him like he was on payroll, not in the family. And a quiet, calculating outsider would later twist that tension into something darker, something the world didn't know had cut Ringo deeper than any headline. After decades of silence, he's finally spoken in names he could never forgive. And trust me, one of them is the last person fans ever expected. But Ringo's bitterness didn't begin in Abbey Road. It didn't start with fame, or with the Beatles, or with the music industry. It began years earlier, in a cold hospital ward in wartime Liverpool. Before he was Ringo Starr, he was Richard Starkey, a small boy who spent more time staring at white ceilings than chalkboards. First, peritonitis nearly killed him. Then tuberculosis locked him away again. He missed entire years of school, watching other kids move on without him. When he finally walked outside again, he wasn't the loudest or the smartest. He was the quiet one, the shy one, the boy who always felt 2 steps behind. That feeling followed him, into the clubs, into the hurricanes, and eventually into the biggest band the world has ever known. And that childhood insecurity, unspoken, buried, would shape every moment of conflict still waiting ahead. Long before the fame, the money, and the madness, he was just a sickly kid from Liverpool who found comfort in the rhythm of a drum beat. The drums became his second heartbeat, steady, dependable, something he could control when life gave him nothing else. In Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, he wasn't the star attraction. He wasn't the wild showman, but he was the drummer who never broke, never wavered, never missed. So when the Beatles needed someone stronger than Pete Best in 1962, they called him. He stepped into EMI Studios not as a guest, but as the upgrade, the missing piece to a rising phenomenon. And almost immediately, the floor dropped beneath him. At the Love Me Do session, producer George Martin wasn't convinced the new drummer could carry a hit. Without warning, he hired session pro Andy White to play instead. Years later, Ringo confessed, "I went through hell personally because George Martin had this Andy White session drummer. I made him apologize every day. It was the first bruise on a long list. Imagine being invited into the world's greatest band only to be replaced before anyone even knows your name." Then came the press. They mocked his playing. They labeled him the luckiest Beatle. Critics claimed he survived only because Lennon and McCartney liked having him around. Your first real moment in the spotlight, and the headline is, "You're the weak link." Inside the band, the hierarchy was carved in stone. John and Paul were the architects. George was the overlooked genius fighting for a seat at the table. And Ringo? He was the friendly drummer, the comic relief, the man expected to smile and keep the beat. But when Brian Epstein died in 1967, removing the only person who could calm the storms inside the group, that gentle, good-natured drummer suddenly found himself standing alone between 3 egos big enough to shake the entire Beatles empire. He never said it publicly at the time, but behind closed doors, Ringo Starr admitted something few Beatles fans ever imagined. The person who made him feel the smallest wasn't a critic, or a journalist, or even the fans who called him the luckiest drummer alive. It was Paul McCartney. Not the friendly thumbs-up Paul the world knew, but the relentless perfectionist who stepped into the power vacuum after Brian Epstein died. A workhorse that dragged the band forward while accidentally dragging Ringo's confidence through the floor. Inside the studio, Paul wasn't just writing songs, he was telling everyone how to play them. Ringo said it plainly years later. Paul always made the phone call. Paul wanted us to work all the time because he's the workaholic. On paper, that's admirable. Inside the Beatles, it felt like control. And then came the moment that finally cracked Ringo. On the White Album sessions in 1968, Paul became obsessed with the tiniest details. Tiny drum accents, minor timing choices, microscopic things only he cared about. He made Ringo redo a basic pattern again, until he crossed the line. Paul McCartney sat down at the drum kit and played the part himself. For the drummer who had already been replaced on Love Me Do, it wasn't just a correction. It was a message. You're optional. Ringo walked out, left the band, vanished for nearly 2 weeks while the others stumbled without him. All because he was tired of feeling like equipment instead of a partner. Years later, he still carried the sting. If Paul didn't trust his drumming, what was he even doing in the Beatles? Paul's perfectionism pushed the band to legendary heights, but it also made his bandmates feel like session musicians on their own records. For Ringo, the man who already bore the stigma of being the replacement, watching Paul physically take his seat was like watching his deepest insecurity come to life. And here's the twist no one saw coming. The man who once made Ringo feel invisible became the last Beatle who stood by him. In 2015, Paul walked on stage at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, not as the superstar, not as the band leader, but as Ringo's friend, and personally inducted him as a solo artist. A lifetime after the hurt, the two men who clashed the hardest became the ones who stayed connected the longest. Ringo Starr had always believed he knew the man standing behind the drums, the John Lennon who anchored the Beatles, who held the band together when egos clashed and tempers flared. But in 1968, that John was vanishing before his eyes, replaced by someone unrecognizable. And the person responsible wasn't a rival musician or a manager, it was Yoko Ono. Yoko didn't just walk into John's life. She stormed the studio, the creative process, even the unspoken hierarchy of the band. What had been a 4-member circle of equals became 5 presences in the room, and suddenly only one voice seemed to matter. Ringo watched in disbelief as sessions grew tense, experimental, and utterly unpredictable. Yoko's suggestions on tone, rhythm, or arrangement weren't debated. They were immediately adopted by John. He no longer defended his bandmates. Once he turned to Ringo and bluntly said, "Just keep it even, that's enough." For a drummer already carrying whispers that he was the weakest link, those words cut deep. Your opinion ends where hers begins. Conflict escalated. George Harrison, frustrated, finally snapped, and John exploded, slamming a table, accusing the others of disrespect. It wasn't about the music anymore. It was about loyalty, and John's loyalty had shifted. For Ringo, a man who valued harmony above all, the emotional toll was staggering. He saw the Beatles losing their anchor, not to another musician, not to the pressures of fame, but to a love so consuming it left no room for anyone else. The band's leader was gone, swallowed by a relationship that demanded everything, leaving the rest of us gasping for air. And Ringo, ever the peacemaker, had no map to navigate the fallout. They say history is written by the victors. But sometimes history is stolen. Ringo Starr never imagined that the band he loved like brothers could fracture from within. In later years, he admitted something that still haunts fans. The Beatles were already drifting apart. And in a rare, haunting memory, Ringo recalled visiting John Lennon in New York in 1980. The laughter, the easy camaraderie, the sense that no distance or time had truly separated them. Weeks later, John was gone, assassinated before they could ever confront the anger, the hurt, or the unresolved tension between them. Their hatred vanished with him, leaving only regret. Then comes Allan Klein, the outsider who turned friendship into warfare. At first, his arrival didn't feel threatening. It felt like salvation. With Brian Epstein dead and Apple bleeding money, the Beatles were sinking under the weight of their own fame. Executives had come and gone, polite and powerless. Then Klein arrived, blunt, aggressive, a hustler who promised to protect them. John embraced him instantly. George followed. Ringo, craving stability more than anything, signed on too. "I thought it was time someone hustled for me," he later admitted. But Klein wasn't just a fixer. He was a strategist, a man who studied every crack in their foundation. Paul's obsession with control, John's restless spirit, George's simmering resentment, Ringo's desperate wish for peace, Klein weaponized it all. Boardroom meetings turned into battles. Once simple decisions became 3 against 1, and in just months, the quiet tension exploded into a full-scale rupture. The band that had conquered the world was now tearing itself apart from the inside. Ringo Starr thought he knew betrayal until he met Allan Klein. When Paul refused to sign a contract, Klein whispered in the ears of John, George, and Ringo, urging them to move forward without him. It seemed like a business decision at the time, but it became a chasm that would swallow their brotherhood. By 1970, Paul sued the other 3 Beatles and Klein himself. Lawsuits replaced laughter, courtrooms replaced camaraderie, and every bond between Ringo and the others was stretched, torn, and almost forgotten. Distrust, resentment, regret. These weren't just words, they were scars that ran through every rehearsal, every studio, every note. Then came the cruel twist. By 1973, Ringo saw the man he had trusted, not just mismanaging money, but manipulating contracts and using the Beatles as pawns in his own game. Klein was fired. Investigations unraveled the damage, and the 3 Beatles who once stood by him, Ringo included, had to admit they were wrong. Alan Steckler later revealed a confession from George that cut deeper than any lawsuit. "The only way the Beatles can ever get together again is if Alan isn't there. I'm ready. So is Ringo." For Ringo, Klein wasn't just a bad manager. He was the architect of the deepest betrayal, the man who ensured the Beatles would never share a stage again. And yet, amid the wreckage, the truth about Ringo Starr's talent began to surface. With the band broken, critics' voices grew louder. The jokes, the drummer who got lucky, the Beatle carried by Lennon and McCartney, echoed endlessly. Without the band to hide behind, Ringo was left facing the harshest question. Was he really the least talented Beatle? Time would tell the truth. Those same sessions where Paul claimed the drum seat and John dismissed him were the sessions where producers noticed something remarkable. Ringo almost never drifted off tempo. Martin himself, the man who once replaced him on Love Me Do, later admitted it. Ringo wasn't just reliable, he was the backbone, the steady pulse that held the chaos together. Ringo Starr had been underestimated, undervalued, even mocked. But when the smoke cleared, the world began to see what the band's producers and the band itself eventually already knew. Ringo's legacy wasn't luck, It was mastery. Most people think Ringo Starr was just the drummer, the guy in the back keeping time, but that's dead wrong. He was the click track, the human anchor holding the Beatles together when everything else threatened to fall apart. Young drummers studied his parts and hit a wall. They couldn't copy his feel. That groove wasn't accidental. It was instinct, precision, and heart. As the years went on, the story flipped. Ringo's solo career didn't just survive, it soared. Real hits, real respect. Legends like George Harrison, Eric Clapton, Bob Dylan, and Elton John kept calling him back, not out of nostalgia, but because his groove lifted their music to another level. Even Paul McCartney, the same man who once corrected his drumming, later inducted him into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a solo artist. Here's the truth nobody talks about. Ringo wasn't the weak link. He was the heartbeat, the steady foundation that let the other three soar. And the more time passes, the clearer it becomes. He was the piece no one realized they couldn't live without. So here's the question. After decades of tension, betrayals, and lawsuits, who do you think Ringo resented the most? Paul, John, or Allan Klein? Drop your thoughts in the comments and tell me whose role in this saga shocked you the most.